In the 1960s, especially the late 60s and on into the early and mid-1970s, what occupied the minds of many Americans was the war in Vietnam. American involvement in Southeast Asia was the direct result of the containment policy as it developed under Presidents Truman and Eisenhower in the 50s. Eisenhower used the CIA to help the government of South Vietnam in its guerrilla war with communists from the North. Eisenhower believed that it was vital to hold the line against communism in Vietnam because if Vietnam fell to the communists, all of Asia would follow. Eisenhower believed in the so-called domino theory of world politics. In a press conference held in 1954, he explained, "You have a row of dominoes set up, you knock over the first one, and what will happen to the last one is the certainty that it will go very quickly. You could have the beginning of a disintegration that would have the most profound influences." John F. Kennedy basically accepted the validity of Eisenhower's domino theory. When Eisenhower left office in 1961, there were 2,000 American military advisors in South Vietnam. Kennedy increased the number to 16,000. These military advisors did not really prepare the South Vietnamese for the kind of war they would actually have to face. Vietnam was basically an insurgency, a war of guerrilla tactics, infiltrations, and sabotage, rather than a Korea-style war of mass invasions and pitched battles. Kennedy and some of his advisors advocated counterinsurgency tactics, cutting the communist guerrillas, the so-called Viet Cong, off from the South Vietnamese people and ensuring the loyalty of those people. Counterinsurgency was sometimes described as winning the hearts and minds of the South Vietnamese people. But the U.S. Army continued to approach Vietnam in terms of a conventional war rather than a counterinsurgency. Or as one officer put it, quote, "If we grab them by the balls, their hearts and minds are sure to follow." Kennedy continued to rely primarily upon the South Vietnamese themselves to defeat the communists. South Vietnam in the late 50s and early 60s was led by a dictator named Ngo Dinh Diem, who was rapidly losing the support of his own people because of his repressive measures that were directed not only at communists but against internal critics as well. When it became apparent that Diem was not going to institute crucial economic and social reforms, a group of South Vietnamese generals met with the American ambassador and proposed a coup. Assured that the United States would not stand in their way, on November 1st, 1963, these generals murdered Diem and his brother and seized control of the government. Kennedy never fully clarified his views on Vietnam. In July of 1962, he had formulated a plan for the phased withdrawal of American forces by the end of 1965. Yet a year later, in July 1963, he said that for us to withdraw would mean a collapse not only of South Vietnam, but of Southeast Asia. Most of Kennedy's supporters argue that he would have withdrawn American troops from Vietnam, but the fact remains that his decisions deepened American involvement and constituted a major step toward entrapping the United States in a land war in Asia. The Vietnam War would be one of Kennedy's major legacies. Although there were 16,000 American advisors in Vietnam at the time of Kennedy's assassination, just 3 weeks after the murder of Diem in November of 1963, Vietnam was still not one of the major concerns of the American people. Lyndon Johnson barely mentioned Vietnam in his 1964 State of the Union address. The first major step in the escalation of the Vietnam War came in August 1964, when North Vietnamese torpedo boats allegedly attacked 2 American destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin off the coast of North Vietnam. I say allegedly because what happened in the Gulf of Tonkin in August of '64 is somewhat murky. The attacks almost certainly took place, but many are convinced that the American ships fired first. But regardless of exactly what happened, President Johnson used the incident in the Gulf of Tonkin as a pretext to ask Congress to give him the authority to use whatever force he deemed necessary to combat communist aggression in Southeast Asia. The resulting Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which gave Johnson that power, passed the Senate by a vote of 88-2 and the House by a vote of 416-0. Then, in February 1965, the Viet Cong launched a mortar attack against an American barracks at Pleiku. 8 American advisors were killed and 126 were wounded. Johnson retaliated by ordering Operation Rolling Thunder, which was the first bombing campaign against North Vietnamese targets conducted by American planes. In the spring of 1965, Johnson sent the first American combat troops to South Vietnam. Thus began the so-called Americanization of the war. By the end of 1965, there were over 184,000 American troops in Vietnam, and in Pentagon parlance, the war was escalated over the course of the next 2 or 3 years, so that by the beginning of 1968, there were almost 500,000 American troops in country. Johnson tried to walk a narrow line in Vietnam. He wanted to send enough American troops to guarantee that the communists would not win, but he didn't want to use so much force that the Soviets or the Chinese would enter the war on an active basis as they had done in Korea. And thus, from the very beginning of the American troop buildup, the goal was to keep the communists from winning rather than to achieve a victory in the traditional sense of the word.